I almost didn't go to the bank that morning. 8 months after my wife passed, I still hadn't cleaned out her safety deposit box. Every time I thought about driving down to First National on Elm Street, something in my chest locked up tight and I'd find a reason to stay home. Water the garden, fix the fence post, anything to avoid sitting in that quiet little room where Margaret used to say she kept her important papers and her peace of mind. But my attorney Frank had been gentle about it for the past 2 months, and that particular Tuesday in March, he wasn't gentle anymore. He called at 7:30 in the morning and told me the estate couldn't close until I cleared the box. So I put on my coat, drove the 11 miles into Clarksville, Tennessee, and walked through those glass doors like a man walking into a cold wind. Ruth Calloway had been the branch manager there for almost 15 years. Margaret and I knew her the way, someone in a small city well enough to wave across a parking lot, close enough to ask about her kids by name. When she saw me come through the door, she didn't smile the way people do when they haven't seen you in a while. She smiled the way people do when they've been worried. She came around the counter before I'd even reached the service desk. "Harold," she said quietly, "I'm glad you came in. I was going to call you this week." She glanced over her shoulder toward the other tellers, then back at me. "Can we go to my office for a minute before we go down to the vault?" I followed her without a word. She closed the door and sat across from me with her hands folded on the desk, the way someone sits when they're about to say something they've rehearsed. "Harold, 9 days ago, someone came in and attempted to access Margaret's safety deposit box." I stared at her. They had a form of identification and a document that claimed to establish next of kin access. Our procedure requires the estate executor to present the original death certificate and probate documentation. This person had copies, not originals, and the notarization looked off to one of my tellers. She paused. We denied access and asked them to leave. I asked her who it was. She turned her computer monitor toward me. The security footage was grainy, the way bank cameras always are, but I didn't need high definition to recognize the man in the gray jacket standing at the vault entrance window. The set of those shoulders, the way he shifted his weight to his left foot when he was nervous. I'd known that posture for 34 years. It was my son, Daniel. I sat in Ruth's office for a long time after that, long enough that she brought me a cup of coffee without asking. I held it without drinking it. My son had tried to get into his mother's safety deposit box 9 days after I finally found the courage to come here myself. 9 days after Frank told me we needed to close the estate. Either Daniel had been watching and waiting, or someone had told him I was finally moving. Neither option felt good. We went down to the vault. Ruth gave me privacy and pulled the door mostly closed behind her. The box was a standard gray metal rectangle, and when I lifted the lid I found exactly what Margaret always kept there, the deed to our house, both our birth certificates, her grandmother's ring in a velvet pouch, normal things, expected things, and underneath all of it, a sealed white envelope with my name on it in her handwriting. Not Harold, not Dad, not even her little nickname for me that she'd used since our second date. She'd written my full name, Harold James Whitfield, the way you'd address something you needed a person to take seriously. I sat down in that little chair and I opened it. Margaret had written 4 pages, front and back, in the careful cursive she'd learned from the nuns at St. Catherine's in 1971 and never lost. The date at the top was 11 weeks before the accident that killed her. She wrote that she loved me and that she was sorry she hadn't come to me sooner. She wrote that she'd been trying to confirm what she suspected before she said anything, because she knew how I felt about Victor Hargrove and she didn't want me making decisions out of anger before she had proof. She wrote that she was scared, not for herself, she said, but of what the truth would do to our family. Then she told me what she'd found. Margaret had worked the books for Whitfield and Hargrove Construction for 6 years after I brought Victor on as a partner in 2009. We built commercial properties across Middle Tennessee warehouses, small retail centers, one assisted living facility outside Nashville that I was proud of. Victor had the client relationships and the sales instinct. I had the operations background and the licenses. For the first 7 years, it worked the way a good partnership is supposed to. Margaret had stopped doing the books in 2016 when her mother got sick and she needed to focus elsewhere. I hired an accounting firm. I trusted Victor. I trusted the numbers they gave me each quarter. What Margaret found, 3 years after she'd stepped away from the books, was a second set of them. She hadn't been looking. She'd gone into my home office to find a stapler and opened the wrong desk drawer. There was a folder that wasn't mine, with our company letterhead on the documents inside, and the numbers in that folder did not match the reports I'd been receiving. She hadn't understood everything she was looking at, so she'd quietly started photographing pages with her phone over the following weeks, going back into that drawer when I wasn't home, building a record before she approached anyone. What those documents showed, as best as Margaret could piece together, was that Victor had been running a parallel billing structure on at least 4 major projects over the past 6 years. Inflated subcontractor invoices, payments to companies that existed only on paper, the gap between what clients were charged and what was actually spent going somewhere that wasn't our company accounts. And the name that appeared on 2 of the internal routing memos wasn't Victor's. It was Daniel's. My son had been working at Whitfield and Hargrove for 4 years by then, managing project logistics. I'd given him that job because I believed in giving family responsibility, in building something worth handing down. I'd told myself I was preparing him for a future. What I hadn't been watching was what he was doing with the access that future required. The letter ended with Margaret writing that she'd copied the photographs onto a USB drive, which she'd placed in a small red case in the safety deposit box, and that she'd been planning to contact our attorney Frank and a forensic accountant she'd researched before she talked to me. She wanted it buttoned up. She wanted to protect me from acting before we knew everything. 11 weeks later, she was dead. A wet road, a guardrail, a curve she'd driven 100 times. I sat in that vault room for a long time. Then I found the small red case tucked beneath her grandmother's ring, put it in my coat pocket, and walked out into the March afternoon. I want to be honest about what those first few days were like. I didn't sleep. I barely ate. I'd sit at the kitchen table in the early morning hours with Margaret's letter in front of me and cycle through grief and anger in a rotation I couldn't control. I missed her so much it was physical, a pressure behind my sternum that hadn't left since October, and now that missing was threaded through with something sharper. She had been carrying this alone. She had been photographing documents in secret for weeks while she cooked dinner and tended the garden and sat beside me on the porch in the evenings. She had been protecting me, and then she was gone, and the protection went with her. On the 4th day, I called Frank. I drove to his office, and I sat across from him, and I put the USB drive and the letter on his desk without saying anything. He read the letter twice, then he plugged in the drive and scrolled through the photos for almost 20 minutes without speaking. When he finally looked up at me, his expression wasn't surprise. It was the careful, neutral look of a man who has seen this kind of thing before and understands that the person sitting across from him is operating on a very thin edge. He said we needed to move carefully. He said he wanted to bring in a forensic accountant named Beverly Marsh, who worked in Nashville and had testified in 3 federal fraud cases. He said I should not confront Victor, should not confront Daniel, should not give any indication that anything had changed. I asked him about the accident. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said that question was not something he could answer, and that it was a question for a different kind of professional. But he didn't dismiss it. He just held it in the air between us the way serious men hold serious possibilities. I drove home and fed the dog and sat on the porch and watched the fields go dark. Beverly Marsh was a small woman in her early 50s who wore reading glasses on a chain and spoke about financial fraud the way a surgeon speaks about anatomy, precisely, dispassionately, without sentimentality about what she was cutting open. She came to Frank's office on a Thursday morning and spent 4 hours with the USB drive and a laptop and a yellow legal pad, and when she was done, she asked me 3 questions and gave me 2 pieces of information. The first, based on what she could see in the documents Margaret had photographed, the scheme had been running for approximately 6 years and involved billing inflation and ghost vendor payments across at least 7 projects. Her preliminary estimate of the total diverted was somewhere between $800,000 and $1.2 million. The second, the internal routing memos with Daniel's name on them, indicated he had approved payment releases to 2 of the ghost vendors. Whether he had understood the full structure or had been partially deceived was not something she could determine from these documents alone. But his name was there, in writing, twice. I drove home and I thought about my son. Daniel was 31 years old. His mother had named him after her father. He'd played baseball through high school, had a gap year that stretched into 2 before he came to work for us, had always been the child who needed more runway than his sister Claire before he found his footing. I'd given him that runway. I'd given him the job and the patience and every chance I had to give. And I thought about Victor. Victor Hargrove had been at my wedding. He had sat at my table at Margaret's funeral and put his hand on my shoulder and said whatever people say at those times. He had looked me in the eyes and said those words. And sometime before that, he had built a structure designed to quietly drain the company I'd spent 30 years building, and he had pulled my son into it to make it harder to unravel. I called Frank and told him to move forward with everything. Beverly needed access to the actual company financial systems to complete her analysis, which meant Frank had to carefully navigate a legal process that didn't tip our hand. He filed a request for a routine auditor review as part of the estate proceedings. My ownership stake in the company was part of the estate, which gave us a procedural door. Victor raised no objection. He had no reason to expect that the audit was anything other than routine paperwork. Beverly spent 3 weeks in the company files. The number she came back with was $1.1 million over 6 years, across 9 projects, 11 shell companies, most of them dissolved, one still technically active in the name of a relative of Victor's, who likely had no idea their information had been used. The structure was sophisticated enough that it had survived 3 years of quarterly reports from our accounting firm, who Beverly believed had been negligent but probably not complicit. Daniel's documented involvement was in the approval of 8 specific payment releases over a 2-year period. Whether he'd understood from the start or had been gradually drawn in was, Frank said, something that would matter later, but not right now. Frank filed with the FBI field office in Nashville on a Wednesday morning. He'd been in contact with an agent there, a woman named Special Agent Torres, who had reviewed Beverly's summary and told Frank she was interested. The week after Frank filed, I drove to Daniel's apartment. I want to explain why I did this before the arrests, before everything was fully resolved. I want to explain it because I've thought about it many times since. The honest answer is that I needed to look at my son before the world fell in on him. I needed to see his face. Not to give him a chance to run, I'd already told Frank, and what was moving without my hand on it anymore. But I needed one moment that was just between us, before lawyers and federal agents in courtrooms made every conversation a transaction. He opened the door in a t-shirt and jeans, and I could see immediately that he knew something was wrong. He had his mother's instincts, always had. He could read a room before he walked into it. I asked if I could come in. We sat at his kitchen table, and I didn't speak for a long time. He waited. That was new. The Daniel I'd raised would have filled the silence with words. This one waited. I told him I'd been to the bank. I told him about the letter. I told him about Beverly and Frank. I told him that I wasn't there to threaten him or bargain with him or give him a way out. I just needed to know one thing. Had he known when it started what Victor was actually doing? He looked at the table for a long time. Then he looked at me. He said no. He said Victor had told him the payments were for a subcontractor arrangement that operated outside the standard billing system for legal reasons he'd described as tax structuring. He said he'd known it was unusual, but that Victor was the senior partner and he'd trusted him. He said that 6 months in, he'd started to understand it wasn't what Victor had described, and that by then Victor had made very clear what it would mean for Daniel if he tried to walk away. He said he'd been trying to figure out how to get out of it for 2 years. He said he hadn't known about his mother's investigation. I believed him. Not because I needed to, and not because it made everything easier. I believed him because he'd always been a terrible liar since he was 7 years old, and because the look on his face when I said his mother's name was the same look I'd seen in the mirror every morning since October. I told him what was coming. I told him he needed a very good attorney. Then I told him I loved him. And I went home. The FBI moved on a Friday morning 6 weeks later. Victor was arrested at his office on a federal fraud charge, while a forensic team began pulling the company's financial records. By the time I heard about it from Frank, it was already done. I won't pretend it felt the way revenge stories are supposed to feel. There was no moment of standing over someone with the upper hand, no confrontation where I got to deliver the line that ties everything up. What I felt, mostly, was tired, in a way that goes deeper than sleep can reach. And underneath the tired, something that might have been relief. The investigation into Margaret's accident was opened separately by a different office, based on Frank's formal request. I can't tell you that I got a definitive answer. What I can tell you is that the accident reconstructionist who reviewed the original report found anomalies he characterized as worth examining, and that the investigation remains open as of the last time I spoke with Frank. Whether it ever closes with a clean answer, I don't know. I've had to make a kind of peace with not knowing. What I do know is that my wife spent the last weeks of her life trying to protect what we'd built together. That she was methodical and brave, and she did it quietly, without alarm, the same way she'd done everything difficult in her life. She put the evidence somewhere safe, and she wrote me a letter, and she signed it the same way she signed our Christmas cards and every birthday note she ever tucked into my coat pocket. All my love, always. Margaret. The company was restructured through the legal proceedings. Victor's assets were subject to a recovery order, and while I knew the full $1 million would never come back in totality, enough came back to matter. My attorneys dissolved the partnership, and I held the licenses, so what remained of Whitfield and Hargrove became mine alone to decide about. I brought in a project manager I trusted and scaled back to the work I could oversee closely. Smaller projects. Clients I knew personally. The kind of work I'd done before Victor came along and everything got large and complicated. Daniel cooperated fully with the investigation. His attorney negotiated a resolution that involved a significant fine and a period of supervised probation. He did not serve prison time, which I know some people who hear this story will have opinions about. I've made my own peace with it. He's working in a different field now, away from construction, and we speak on the phone twice a week. It's slow, the way trust is always slow when it has to be rebuilt, rather than simply maintained. But it's real. Claire, my daughter, came down from Cincinnati when everything broke and stayed for 3 weeks. She cleaned out the rest of Margaret's things, which I hadn't been able to do. She made dinners and sat with me in the evenings and didn't try to fix what couldn't be fixed. She's always known when to talk and when to simply be present, a gift she got from her mother that I've been grateful for many times. There is one more thing I want to say, and it's the thing I've turned over most often in the months since all of this happened. I'm 68 years old. When Victor brought Daniel into that scheme, I think part of the calculation was that I was the older partner, the one winding down, the one who might not look too closely at things he trusted other people to handle, the one who'd handed the paperwork to an accounting firm and stopped asking questions because the numbers were fine and the projects were getting done, the one whose wife had stepped back from the books and whose son was there every day and who maybe didn't see as sharply as he once had. That calculation was wrong. But I have to be honest about why it was almost right. I'd gotten comfortable. I'd let trust become a substitute for attention. I'd done what a lot of men my age do, built something, stabilized it, and then let the monitoring slide because sliding felt like rest. What Margaret understood, what she was trying to give me before she ran out of time, was that the price of comfort is sometimes everything you work to build. I think about her in that office, at my desk, photographing pages with her phone, careful, quiet, determined, not angry, just doing what needed to be done because she loved me and she loved what we'd made together and she wasn't going to let it be taken without a fight. That's who she was for 40 years. I just didn't always see it clearly until I had to. The safety deposit box is closed now. I kept the letter. It's in my desk drawer, not locked. I've read it more times than I can count, and every time I get to the end and see her handwriting sign off with those words, I feel the full weight of losing her and the full weight of what she gave me at the same time. I've started paying closer attention to everything. The books, the contracts, the people I work with, and why I trust them. I ask questions I used to assume I knew the answers to. I don't let comfort become complacency anymore. It's not the lesson I would have chosen, but it's the one I have, and I intend to keep it.